The station had no windows. It did not need them. The celestial conclave floated in deep space, anchored between two dying stars, and the light that poured through its corridors came not from any sun, but from thousands of glowing signs, neon tubes, and the soft hum of gambling machines that never stopped running. It was the kind of place that made you forget time. That was the point. Time made people careful. The conclave preferred them reckless. Ships docked at the station every hour. Traders came, soldiers came, diplomats, wanderers, merchants chasing luck. All of them came, and they all left lighter than they arrived. That was the promise of the celestial conclave. Not that you would win, never that. The promise was simply that you would play. The station had been in operation for 800 years, under the control of the Vrethkai Syndicate. The Vrethkai were a tall, scaled people, with narrow yellow eyes, and a patience that bordered on the geological. They had built the conclave from a single platform and expanded it across 7 connected rings over the centuries. They had survived 3 galactic wars, 2 economic collapses, and 1 attempted takeover by a rival crime family. Through all of it, their greatest point of pride remained unchanged. The house had never gone bankrupt, not once. The pit boss on duty that particular cycle was a Vrethkai named Sorjal. He was old enough to remember when the outer ring was still under construction, and young enough to still enjoy his work. He stood near the entrance of the main floor, his scales the color of dried rust, watching the new arrivals filter in from the docking bay. Most were regulars. A few were fresh targets. He could tell the difference in 3 seconds. The human walked in on cycle 43 of the standard rotation. Sorjal noticed him immediately. Not because humans were rare, they were not. Earth had been part of the galactic community for 60 years. But because of how the man carried himself. He was not dressed well. His jacket was patched at one elbow, and his boots had seen better decades. He was not young, not old, somewhere in the flat middle of a human life, with short dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that showed a great deal of patience. He carried 1 bag. He looked at nothing in the room as though everything in it was already known to him. His name was Kale Morrow. He had once held a senior position in Earth's diplomatic corps, a job that had taken him to 11 different star systems, and across the negotiating table from species that made humans look very small and very temporary. 3 years ago, a failed treaty with the Hethani Assembly had cost him that job. His superiors needed someone to blame, and Kale had been convenient. He had not argued. He had simply gathered his things and left. He had been drifting since then, taking small jobs, moving on. He had developed the particular skill of the long-term wanderer, which was the ability to walk into any room and immediately understand what kind of room it was. This room, he had decided before he crossed the threshold, was a trap with beautiful furniture. He approached the exchange counter, converted the last of his credits into station tokens, and made his way to the main floor. He ordered something warm from a passing service drone and sat down near the edge of the room to watch. This was always his first step in any unfamiliar place. He watched. The main game on the floor was called the Cascade. It was played at a large circular table with a surface made of reactive glass that shifted colors based on the decisions of the players. The rules were complex, layered, and deliberately designed to be difficult to explain. Every alien species that had tried to describe the Cascade in writing had produced a document that was technically accurate and completely useless. You could only understand the game by watching it, and even then, the understanding was partial. That was the design. The house made its best money when the players were confused. Kale watched for 2 hours. He did not take notes. He simply watched with the calm attention of a man who had once spent 40 days in a room with no windows, helping 2 alien governments decide where their border was. This happened sometimes. New arrivals studied the floor before playing. They thought they were learning something. The pit boss found it charming. The way you find a young predator charming before it realizes the fence is electric. He walked over. He looked down at the human from his considerable height, and allowed himself a small smile that showed a single row of flat teeth. "You have been sitting there for 2 hours," Sorjal said. His translator unit rendered the words in clean, unaccented galactic standard. "Most of our guests find a table within 15 minutes. Kale looked up at him without hurry. "Most of your guests lose within 15 minutes, he said. I was watching to see why." Something about the way the human said it, calm, no challenge in it, just a statement of observation, made the 2 Vrethkai guards near the entrance turn their heads slightly. Sorjal kept his expression smooth. "And did you figure it out?" he asked. "Getting there," Kale said. Sorjal let out a low sound that passed for amusement among his people. He was not offended. Humans said things like this sometimes. They had a quality that the Vrethkai behavioral files described as performative confidence, a bluffing instinct inherited from millions of years as a medium-sized predator on a planet full of larger ones. It looked like boldness. It was, in the Syndicate's experience, simply noise. "We have a standing challenge," Sorjal said, because the thought had occurred to him and it seemed like entertainment. "Any player who can beat the cascade unassisted 30 consecutive cycles wins a prize worth more than most ships in the dock. No one has won in 400 years. He paused. "You are welcome to try, or you are welcome to play a simpler game and have a pleasant evening." He said the second option in a tone that made clear it was the recommended one. Kale was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cascade table. Then he looked down at his near-empty cup. "What happens if I lose?" he asked. "Standard forfeit. 30 cycles of indentured service to the Syndicate. Labor contract, fully legal under Conclave Charter." Sorjal spread his hands. "It almost never comes to that. Most players exhaust their tokens long before the forfeit applies." Kale nodded slowly. He set down his cup. He stood up, and he was shorter than Sorjal by a significant amount, which did not seem to bother him at all. "All right," he said. "I'll take the challenge." The laughter started at the nearby tables before the words had finished settling in the air. 2 Brethian traders nudged each other. A group of Hethani card players turned to look. Even the service drones seemed to pause for a half-second, as though their programming had registered something unusual. Sorjal processed the acceptance with professional grace. He gestured toward the cascade table and began the formal registration. At the far end of the room, behind a wall of one-way glass, a senior Vrethkai elder watched the scene on a monitor and said nothing. He had seen this before. Not with humans specifically. They were too new to the galaxy for that. But with other species who arrived with big eyes and small wallets, and the specific kind of confidence that comes from not yet knowing what they don't know. Near the back of the observation gallery, half hidden behind a support pillar, an old alien watched the proceedings with an expression that was harder to read. He was a Krethaun, a species known for their extremely long lives and their habit of studying other civilizations the way a person might study weather, methodically, patiently, without judgment. His name was Vasin, and he had spent the last 40 years of his 300-year life writing academic work about humanity. He watched the humans sit down at the cascade table. He watched the pit boss signal the start of the challenge with a small, confident gesture that meant he expected this to be over quickly. He watched Kale Morrow pick up the game pieces with the careful hands of a man touching something for the first time, but intending to touch it many more times after. Vasin leaned toward his companion, a young research assistant with wide eyes and no context for what he was seeing. "I have studied humans for 40 years, Vasin said quietly. "Their history, their wars, the things they have survived." He watched Kale look at the table with that flat, patient expression. "These people have made a very serious mistake tonight." His assistant looked at the human, small, underdressed, sitting alone at the most difficult table in the station, and then back at his mentor. "The human?" he asked. "Or the house?" Vasin watched for another moment before answering. "The house," he said. The Cascade was not a game so much as it was a system designed to take things from you. This was true of most games, but most games were at least honest about their intentions. The Cascade wore the face of something learnable. It let you feel in the early rounds, as though understanding was possible, as though one more session, one more close study of the shifting glass table, one more careful choice between the 7 move types, and you would have it. You would see the whole thing clearly. And then the game would change, just slightly, just enough, and the understanding would slip away, like sand through a closing fist. It adapted. That was the true mechanism, the one the Vrethkai did not advertise. The game ran on a predictive engine that observed the player and adjusted its variables in real time. If a player was aggressive, the game rewarded caution. If a player was cautious, the game punished hesitation. It learned your patterns faster than you could change them, and then it used your patterns against you with the kind of efficiency that felt, to most players, deeply personal. As though the game had decided it did not like you specifically. Kale Morrow lost his first session. He lost his second. He lost his third through his 7th in a smooth and unbroken streak that drew no attention whatsoever, because players lost at the Cascade constantly. That was the normal behavior. The anomaly would have been winning. Losing was background noise. He came back every cycle. He sat at the same position, played the minimum stake, and lost. He ordered food at the table, which was allowed. He slept in a rented bunk at the back of the station for exactly 4 hours per cycle, which the records would later show was unusually short by human standards, but was consistent with someone either desperate or obsessive. The staff noted his persistence and filed it under the category of problematic gambler, a classification the station used for players who could not be reasoned out of losing their tokens. They were monitored for their own protection mostly, and also because they sometimes caused scenes when they ran out of funds. But Kale was not losing money he could not afford. He had calculated, precisely, how many losing sessions he could sustain before the forfeit clause of the challenge became active. He had 17 cycles of buffer remaining when he sat down at the table on the 8th session and began to do something the Cascade's predictive engine was not accustomed to. He started making moves that had no logic in them. Not random moves. Random would have been processed and absorbed by the system within 2 sessions. These were moves that appeared purposeless from the outside, but were in fact calibrated nonsense. A choice made not because it was good or bad, but because it had no clear motive. A strategy designed not to win the current round, but to produce a specific kind of data point. Kale had spent 7 sessions mapping the engine's responses, and he was now spending the 8th, 9th, and 10th sessions verifying his map. He filled 3 small notebooks with shorthand that none of the translation software on the station could parse. This was not an accident. He had developed the shorthand himself during his diplomatic years, a personal notation system for recording observations in rooms where other parties might be watching. The symbols meant things to him, and nothing to anyone else. The Vrethkai surveillance staff reviewed the footage of him writing, and concluded the notebooks were either a personal journal or evidence of a deteriorating mental state. Both possibilities, in their experience, were common among losing gamblers. He ate at the table and slept in short intervals. He did not drink anything that had alcohol in it, which set him apart from roughly 80% of the Cascade's regular players. He was polite to the staff, tipped the service drones an appropriate amount, and never showed any visible frustration when he lost. This last behavior the staff found the strangest. Every species had a frustration response, humans especially. The behavioral profiles on humans described them as emotionally reactive, prone to outbursts of feeling that interfered with rational decision-making. Kale Morrow, in session after session, showed none of this. What he showed instead was attention. The kind of attention that is not dramatic or visible, but simply relentless. The kind that does not take breaks, that carries on when the body is tired and the stakes feel low, that continues simply because something needs to be understood and the understanding is not finished yet. Sorjal watched him sometimes from across the floor. He had not mentioned the challenge to most of the staff. It was a standing offer, rarely invoked, and rarely worth tracking closely. Most challengers gave up within 4 or 5 sessions. Kale was on session 11 and showed no signs of stopping, which moved him from charming to mildly interesting in the pit boss's estimation. Not concerning, not yet. Just interesting in the way a long, dry spell before rain is interesting. Something is building, you just can't see what. On the 12th session, Kale placed a bet. Not the minimum stake, a real bet, 3 times the minimum, on a specific move sequence that the predictive engine had assigned a win probability of less than 4%. The glass table flickered through its colors. The engine processed the move. It responded with its counter sequence, the one that had beaten 4% situations 11,000 times in its operational history. Kale's counter sequence beat it. The margin was thin. The payout was small. A few nearby players noticed and then looked away, because single wins meant nothing at the cascade. Single wins happened. The house could absorb single wins the way the ocean absorbs a cup of water. But Kale did not smile. He did not celebrate. He wrote something in his notebook in his unreadable shorthand, and then sat very still for a moment, the way a person sits still when they have confirmed something they already suspected was true, but needed to verify before they could trust it completely. The engine had responded exactly as he expected. The map was right. He closed the notebook and looked at the table. 17 sessions of preparation, 11 of them deliberate losses, and he had just confirmed that the game's adaptation algorithm had a structural pattern in the way it responded to sequences with no obvious motive. It overweighted those responses. It treated the irrational as a higher threat than the strategic, because rational strategies could be modeled and countered. And the engine had been built by a species, the Vrethkai, whose psychology assumed rationality was always the baseline. They had built a machine that understood logic very well, and unpredictability almost not at all. This was not a design flaw. It was a philosophical assumption. The Vrethkai had simply never encountered a species that could sustain deliberate illogic at high precision across multiple sessions, without falling apart under the pressure of losing. Most rational beings, when they made irrational moves, did so either in frustration or by accident. The engine was calibrated for those circumstances. It was not calibrated for a former game theory analyst who had spent 3 years drifting through space with nothing but time and a very clear memory of every negotiation that had ever gone wrong. Sorjal had been watching from his usual position across the floor. He saw the win. He saw the thin margin and the small payout and told himself it was nothing. Then he saw the way the human sat still after, and something small and cold moved through him. He could not have said exactly what caused it. It was the posture, maybe, or the absence of any celebration. Winners at the cascade, even small winners, showed something. Relief, pleasure, the brief glow of vindication. Even the most controlled players showed something. Kale Morrow showed nothing, except the particular calm of someone crossing an item off a list they had been working on for a very long time. Sorjal watched him for another few minutes, and then walked away, and told himself there was nothing to be concerned about. The game had never been beaten. The game could not be beaten. That was not optimism. That was 800 years of mathematical evidence. He went back to his other duties. Across the room, Vassin the Crethon scholar lowered his observational tablet and looked at his young assistant with an expression that the assistant had learned, over the past week, meant that something significant had just happened. "What did you see?" Vassin asked. It was the question he used for teaching. He won 1 round. Small win. Unlikely odds. And what else? A pause. He wasn't surprised. Vassin nodded. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone letting a thought finish forming before they spoke it aloud. "I once read a record from the early period of human space exploration," he said. "A ship suffered a catastrophic engine failure in deep space. The crew had no rescue coming. They had limited materials. They spent 40 days improvising repairs, using things that were not designed to be repair materials, solving problems their training had not covered, sustaining one another through conditions that should have destroyed morale completely. He paused. They made it home. The assistant waited. "I have read dozens of stories like that one," Vassin said. "They are not exceptional in human history. They are common. The human capacity for sustained problem-solving under pressure, without external validation, without certainty of success. It is not a heroic trait. It is a species trait. It is how they are built." He looked at the cascade table, where Kale was already setting up for his next round. "That man has been losing for 11 sessions. He has been working this whole time, and he just confirmed something." The assistant looked toward the table. "How do you know he confirmed something?" The quote unpaused. Vassin picked up his tablet again, because he stopped taking notes. Word spread the way it always does in a closed place. Not through any announcement, not through any official channel, but through the slow movement of eyes and whispered comments, and the particular way that beings in gambling establishments pay attention to anything that deviates from the expected. By the 18th session of Kale Morrow's challenge, people were watching. Not many at first. A Grethian couple at an adjacent table who had noticed his consistent returns over 4 sessions, and repositioned themselves for a better view. A pair of Hethani merchants who had asked the staff about the human and been told only that he was an active challenger, and had decided this was worth monitoring. A few others, scattered around the main floor, who had recalibrated their attention in that unconscious way that social animals always do when something in the environment begins to suggest that the expected order of things might be changing. Kale won 3 sessions in a row. The wins were not large. They were careful wins, placed at precise moments on moves the engine had a poor record against, withdrawn before the next round could neutralize the gain. He played like someone navigating a minefield with a map, not fast, not reckless, but with a certainty in the placement of each foot that had nothing to do with luck. The Vrethkai Syndicate reviewed the logs after the 3rd consecutive win. A compliance analyst ran the session data and produced a report that described the wins as within normal probability bounds. This was technically accurate. Each individual win was possible. The pattern of wins was unusual, but not impossible. The report concluded that no action was required. Sorzal read the report and felt the cold thing move through him again, the same feeling he had experienced 2 sessions ago when he watched the human sit still after confirming something. He went back to the floor and stood near the cascade table and watched Kale play for an hour. He could not identify what was wrong. The human's moves looked strange, a mixture of sensible strategy and choices that seemed to serve no purpose. But strange moves were common at the cascade. Players made strange moves all the time. That was part of the design. The difference, Sorzal decided, was in the outcome. Kale's strange moves lost, sometimes too, but never at the rate the engine predicted. And the losses were always small, while the wins were slightly larger. The ratio was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not wrong enough to trigger the compliance protocols, but wrong in the way that a conversation is wrong, when someone is telling the truth and you still feel like something is missing. He called a variance shift on session 20. Under conclave law, the House was allowed to declare a variance shift during any ongoing challenge. This meant the rules of the game could be modified within set parameters. The modifications had to be announced publicly before the session began, and they had to fall within the documented framework of the game. It was a protection built into the charter specifically for situations where a player appeared to be operating outside expected norms. Sorzal announced the variance shift at the start of session 20. The new parameters increased the number of move types from 7 to 9, and added a penalty mechanism to the scoring grid that had not existed before. It was a meaningful change. Players who had studied the 7-type version had to relearn 2 new layers simultaneously while managing a punishment system that specifically targeted the kind of exploratory moves Kale had been using. He had expected the human to protest. Some challengers called for a review when a variance shift was announced. A few had walked away from the challenge entirely, which freed them from the forfeit clause under a specific legal provision that required the syndicate to prove the shift was not retaliatory. Cale looked at the modified table. He looked at the new parameters, and then he laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind that is not performed for an audience, but just escapes from a person when something strikes them as genuinely funny. He shook his head slightly and looked up at Sorzal with an expression that had a warmth in it that the pit boss found completely disorienting. "Good," Cale said. "I was getting bored." He sat down and began playing the modified version. He lost the first 4 rounds under the new parameters. Then he won 2, then lost 1, then won 3 in sequence. The ratio was wrong again. He had adapted to the new rules in real time with a speed that the predictive engine had not modeled as possible. The watchers around the table had grown. There were 11 beings now who had quietly repositioned themselves to observe the cascade table, which was more outside attention than the table had received in over a decade. The Vrethkai dealers exchanged brief looks when they thought Cale wasn't watching them, but Cale always seemed to be watching everything. Vaesen approached him that evening in the corridor outside the main floor. Cale had stopped to eat from a food cart near the service entrance, a quiet corner of the station that most high rollers never visited. The scholar sat down across from him with the deliberateness of a person who has prepared a conversation and is committed to having it. "You are the challenger," Vaesen said, not a question. Cale looked at him. "You're the one who's been watching from the gallery," he said, also not a question. Vaesen accepted this with a nod. He set a small data chip on the surface between them. "I am a researcher. My primary subject is humanity. I have spent 40 years studying your species, your history, your conflict records, your economic patterns, the documentation of your survival events." He nodded toward the chip. "That contains operational records for the Vrethkai Syndicate's cascade challenges over the last 200 years. Session logs, adaptation parameters, payout ratios. I obtained them through legitimate research channels 11 years ago while writing a paper on house probability systems." Cale looked at the chip. He looked at Vaesen. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because I have been waiting," the old scholar said simply, "for a human to sit down at that table, and I would like to see what happens." A quiet moment passed between them. Then Cale picked up the chip. The records were more detailed than he had expected. 200 years of challenger sessions, including the behavioral profiles the syndicate had compiled on each species that had attempted the challenge. They described psychological patterns, noted frustration thresholds, identified the points at which each species typically gave up. The Vrethkai had been running this challenge long enough to have a very precise picture of how failure worked for virtually every known intelligent species. There was a short entry on humans. It described them as emotionally unstable, prone to overconfidence in early sessions, and collapse in middle sessions. It noted a high frustration response and a tendency to make increasingly erratic decisions under sustained losing conditions. The entry concluded that humans were among the lower-risk challengers because their emotional volatility made prolonged rational engagement with the game statistically unlikely. Cale read the entry twice. Then he set the chip down and was quiet for a moment. The profile was not wrong exactly. It described real human tendencies, documented real patterns. What it missed was the variance. What it could not capture was that those tendencies were averages, and averages told you about the center of a distribution, not the edges. At the edges of the human distribution, at the far end of the patience curve, the deep end of the endurance pool, the profile did not apply. And the profile had no way of knowing when it was dealing with an edge case, because it had been written by people who had never met one. He slept 4 hours. He returned to the table. On the 23rd session, Sorzal made the announcement that he had been authorized to escalate the challenge. The Cascade's final mechanism would be activated for the remaining 7 sessions. The Unraveler, the Syndicate's AI dealer, operational for 400 years, undefeated in its entire history, would take over the table. The watching crowd had grown to nearly 30 beings by this point. Several of them made sounds of understanding when the announcement was made. The Unraveler was known. Everyone on the conclave knew what it meant. Kale stood at the table and looked at the machine as it came online, its crystalline interface rising from the center of the table in a slow, smooth motion that was probably designed to be impressive. He looked at it for a long moment. He cracked his knuckles, a small human gesture that Vasine, watching from the gallery, had found in his research files as an involuntary tension response, but which in this context seemed almost like a greeting. "I've played against something like you before," Kale said quietly, not for the crowd, just because the thought was there. "We called it the stock market." He sat down. The Unraveler processed his input signal, registered his presence, and began to calculate. The announcement went out across the station at the start of Cycle 24. A human challenger was in the final phase of the cascade. The Unraveler had been activated. All available floor space near the cascade table was open to observers. The crowd that gathered was the largest the main floor had seen in 11 years. The last time being when a Hethani Grandmaster had made it to the 17th session, before suffering what the medical staff described as a cognitive stress episode, and what the other Hethani present described as a complete psychological collapse. He had been carried off the floor, still making move gestures with his hands. The memory of it had become part of the station's informal history. The story told in corridors late in the cycle, when beings gathered to remind each other that the cascade was serious. There were over 200 observers now. They stood in rough semicircles around the table, 3 deep near the front railing, quieter than a crowd that size usually was. This was not the noise of excitement exactly. It was the quiet of attention, the held breath of beings who have decided they might be watching something that will be worth remembering. The Unraveler sat at the center of the table. It was not a physical presence in the conventional sense. It had no body, no face, no expression to read. It existed as a crystalline interface, a column of reactive glass that ran calculations at a speed no biological mind could match. It had been built 400 years ago by the original Vrethkai engineers who constructed the conclave. It had been updated twice, its processing speed doubled each time, its predictive models expanded to incorporate the behavioral data of every species the Syndicate had ever encountered. It had played 11,000 games and won 11,000 games. Not 11,000 out of 11,002, 11,000 out of 11,000. It had never lost, not once, not by a narrow margin, not in a round that was close. It had never produced an outcome that required the house to pay the challenge prize. The format of the final phase was 10 rounds. The player with the higher cumulative score at the end won. There was no mercy rule, no early exit. You played all 10 rounds regardless of the score, because the Syndicate had learned, centuries ago, that allowing early wins gave challengers a psychological advantage that the house preferred to avoid. Kale sat down at the table. He had slept 4 hours. He had eaten a full meal. He had spent the hour before the session sitting in the observation gallery, empty at that time, before the crowd arrived, with Vasine, going over the 200 years of Unraveler session data from the chip. Not the strategy notes, which would have been useful to any challenger. The behavioral data. The records of how the machine had responded when players made unexpected moves. The micro-adjustments it had made across centuries of play. The Unraveler is not a game, Vasine had said during that quiet hour. It is a model. It holds a model of how intelligent beings play games, and it plays against the model, not against the player. As long as you behave like the model predicts, it cannot lose. And if I don't, Kale had asked, then it recalibrates, quickly. It has done this before, with unpredictable players. It always catches up. Vasine had paused. The only time it cannot catch up is if the unpredictability is not random. If it follows a logic the machine has no framework for. Kale had nodded. He had already known this. He had been building toward it for 23 sessions. Round 1 of the final phase began. He lost it. This surprised the crowd, because most of them had arrived expecting a climax, and instead got what looked like a fairly ordinary defeat. The Unraveler had assessed his opening move in 0.003 seconds, and responded with a counter that left him no good options for the rest of the round. He played out the round and lost by a moderate margin. He lost round 2 by a wider margin. The crowd stirred. Conversations moved through the back rows. He lost round 3. The margin was the widest yet. A Grethian trader near the front railing shook his head and began easing toward the exit. The behavior of someone who has decided the interesting thing is over. Several others shifted their weight. The held breath quality of the crowd began to loosen. Sorjal stood near his usual position and watched with his arms folded. The feeling of wrongness had not left him, but the scoreboard was 3-0 in the house's favor, and the Unraveler showed no signs of difficulty. He told himself this was the correct outcome. He told himself the feeling was residual anxiety from the previous sessions, from watching the human's strange wins, and that now that the Unraveler was running, everything was proceeding as it should. He told himself this with some effort. Kale lost round 4. 4-0. The crowd's energy had changed. It was not celebratory exactly. The house winning was the expected outcome, and expected outcomes do not produce celebration. But there was a settling, a relaxation, a return to the comfortable assumption that things were the way they were supposed to be. In round 5, Kale made a move that stopped the Unraveler for 0.7 seconds. This may not sound significant. For context, the Unraveler had never taken more than 0.1 seconds to respond to any move in its 400-year history. Its longest previous deliberation, documented in the session records, had been 0.4 seconds against a Crethon mathematical prodigy in session 2007. The prodigy had eventually lost. But 0.4 seconds had been, until this moment, the outer boundary of the machine's hesitation. Kale's move registered at 0.7. He won round 5. The crowd noticed, not just the win. Wins happened, the machine could absorb a win, but the pause. The 0.7 second pause, which was visible as a brief stillness in the crystalline interface before the response came. The beings closest to the table had seen it. The ones behind them had seen the ones in front react. A ripple moved back through the crowd. The margin was small but clean. Round 7. Another win. The Unraveler was recalibrating. That was obvious. Its response patterns had shifted. But Kale was not giving it time to fully catch up. He was introducing new variations before the previous round's data could be fully incorporated, layering irrational inputs in sequences that built on each other, creating a prediction problem that compounded each time the machine tried to solve it. The machine was chasing a target that moved in a direction that had no name in its database. Not random. Random could be solved statistically. Not strategic. Strategy could be modeled. This was something the Unraveler's builders had not anticipated because they had never needed to. They had built a machine to defeat rational beings playing rationally, and to defeat irrational beings playing irrationally. They had not built it to defeat a rational being playing irrationally on purpose, with precision, for 7 sessions of preparation before the final match. Round 8, another win, 4-4. The crowd was completely silent. Sorjal had stepped away from his usual position without realizing it. He was standing close to the table now, close enough to see Kale's face. The human's expression had not changed in any of the rounds. Not when he was losing, not when he was winning. The same flat, patient focus that he had worn since the first session. That was when Sorjal understood. Not the game theory, not the mechanics. He did not understand those. What he understood was simpler and more frightening. The human had not been worried. Not in session 1, not in session 4, not in the middle of this final phase when he was 4 rounds down. He had never been worried because he had known, with the quiet certainty of someone who has done the work, that he had already accounted for this moment. The syndicate's senior elder, watching from behind the one-way glass above the floor, reached for his communication device. He said 3 words to the legal team. Prepare the shift. Another variance shift. It could be done, even in the final phase, as long as it was announced before the next round. The announcement was drafted. The legal team reviewed it. The compliance officer approved it. It was 30 seconds from going out across the floor's announcement system when Vassin stood up from his seat in the observation gallery. He was old, and he moved slowly, and it took him a moment to reach the floor level. When he got there, he stood at the edge of the main area and raised a formal conclave witness tablet, a physical device that every being in the station recognized as a legal instrument. I invoke conclave witness law, he said in a voice that carried with complete calm across the silent floor. Formal game proceedings observed by 417 registered witnesses cannot be subject to unilateral rule modification. Any announcement of a variance shift is legally void under Section 12 of the Conclave Charter. The senior elder put down his communication device. The legal team reviewed Section 12. The legal team confirmed the provision was real, was applicable, and had not been invoked in 60 years, because no challenge had ever reached this point with this many witnesses present. The syndicate was trapped inside its own institution. Round 9 began. Cale won it, 5-4. 1 round left. The crowd had stopped breathing again, or had gone back to that state where breathing seemed like something happening at a different level of reality than the one currently in front of them. Round 10. Cale placed his opening move. The unraveler deliberated for 1.2 seconds, a number that would be cited in academic papers about machine cognition for the next 50 years, and then produced a response. Cale answered it with a sequence that the machine's prediction model had assigned a 2.3% probability of success. The machine countered. Cale countered the counter with a move that had appeared, in all previous rounds, to be a losing setup. The machine processed it, integrated it into its model, and produced a response optimized for what the model said should come next. What came next was not what the model predicted. The scores tabulated. The reactive glass table completed its final color cycle and went still. Cale had won by 4 points. The conclave was silent for 3 full seconds. Then the sound came. Not cheering exactly. Not for most of the aliens in the room, because this was not their victory, and they had no particular investment in it. It was something more reflexive than cheering. It was the sound a crowd makes when it has just seen something it did not believe was possible, and the impossibility has become real, and the nervous system needs a moment to process the update. Cale sat back from the table. He rubbed his eyes with the back of one hand. He looked at the final score with the expression of someone seeing a confirmed answer to a question they have been carrying for a very long time. Sorjal stood very still near the table and stared at the scoreboard. Behind the one-way glass, the feed from the senior elder's monitor cut to black. The Vrethkai Syndicate's legal team worked through the next 48 hours without stopping. There were 7 of them in total, 3 specialists in conclave contract law, 2 in interstellar financial instruments, and 2 senior advisors who had been called in from an affiliate station 11 light hours away. They worked in a sealed conference room on the upper level of the conclave, with full access to the syndicate's operational records and the challenge documentation and the testimony of every staff member who had witnessed any portion of the 30-session challenge. The problem was what the payout revealed. The Vrethkai Syndicate had operated for 800 years on the assumption that the challenge would never be won. This was not an unreasonable assumption. It had not been won in 800 years. The insurance structure that the syndicate maintained against the challenge was therefore minimal, a reserve fund that covered roughly 30% of the potential payout, because the actuarial models used to determine adequate reserves had assigned a probability to a winning challenge that made a full reserve a wasteful expense. The models had been correct, statistically, for 800 years. They had not been correct enough. The conclave's financial authority was notified under the mandatory reporting requirements of the Charter. They sent an audit team. The audit team reviewed the reserve fund against the payout obligation, and then, because this was what audit teams did, they reviewed the surrounding financial structures for related irregularities. The surrounding financial structures, it turned out, had been managed with the confidence of an organization that had never genuinely expected to face an existential liquidity event. There were loans outstanding to affiliate stations that had been carried well past their due dates. There were operational accounts that had been underreported in quarterly filings. There were indentured service contracts, hundreds of them, covering beings from dozens of species who had lost challenges over the centuries, that the audit team flagged for legal review. Under conclave law, an indentured service contract required a minimum asset holding by the contracting party to remain valid. The syndicate's assets, once the payout was processed and the audit adjustments were applied, fell below that minimum. The contracts were voided, all of them, simultaneously. Across the conclave, 34 beings who had been working as indentured staff were handed release documents by a conclave administrator. Most of them did not understand what was happening at first. Some of them had been in service for years. A few of them were human, 7 in total, from different years, different loss challenges, different circumstances that had led them to a table they should not have sat at. They received their release documents and stood in the service corridor for a long moment, looking at paper that said they were free, trying to make that information fit into a life that had organized itself around not being free. Kale was in the main floor's small dining area when the payout was confirmed. He was eating a meal that was better than anything he had ordered in the previous 30 sessions, because he could afford it now, and because he had been planning this particular meal as a small private reward for an outcome he had believed in but had never entirely taken for granted. He ate it slowly and with the attention of someone who has learned not to rush things that are worth savoring. Sorzal found him there. The pit boss looked like someone who had not slept in 2 days, which was accurate. He looked, more specifically, like someone who had spent those 2 days revising a belief he had held for his entire professional life, and who had arrived, at the end of that revision, at a new understanding that he was not sure how to hold. He sat down across from Kale without asking permission. Kale looked at him and did not object. They sat in silence for a moment. "I want to understand," Sorzal said finally. "Not the strategy. I have people who can explain the strategy. I want to understand how you knew." Kale set down his fork and looked at the Vrethkai for a moment. He thought about this with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, not performing the thought, just actually thinking. "I didn't know," he said. "Not for certain. I never had certainty. I had a working theory that I kept testing and revising. The certainty you're seeing is something else." "What is it?" Kale was quiet for a moment. "When I was a diplomat," he said, "I was in a negotiation once that went bad on day 22. Both sides walked away. My career was over after that. I spent 3 years trying to figure out what I had done wrong." He paused. "I eventually realized I hadn't done anything wrong. I had done everything I could with what I had, and the outcome was what it was. But the 3 years of looking at it were still useful. They gave me a very clear picture of where the edges of my ability were." "I don't see what this has to do with the game," Sorzal said. "The game was inside my edges," Kale said. "The Unraveler was built to beat beings at a game that tests pattern recognition and adaptability. I happen to be good at both. Not exceptional, not genius level, just good in the specific ways the game requires. I knew that by session 8. He picked up his fork again. The hard part was the time. 30 sessions. Most beings can't sustain that kind of patience without knowing the outcome. Neither can most humans, honestly. But you could." Kale shrugged. "I had nothing else to do." Sorzal looked at him for a long moment. He tried to find something in this explanation that felt adequate, something that explained not just the win, but the whole 30 sessions, the calmness, the notebooks, the laughing when the variance shift was announced. He could not find it. The explanation was too simple and too complete, and somehow that made it harder to accept than a complex one would have been. You studied what we are, Kale said. He said it gently, without accusation. Your behavioral files, your predictive models, all of it. You studied what humans are, on average. You never asked what we've been through. Sorzal waited. Every human alive, Kale said, is the descendant of people who survived things that should have killed them. Not once, hundreds of generations of people who faced something impossible and found a way through it, or found a way around it, or just kept going until the impossible thing moved. We don't know how to quit. It's not a virtue. It's not something we're proud of. It's just how we're made. You build a machine that beats everyone else, and then you invite a human to sit down at it, and you look at the average, and you say the human will collapse under sustained losing. You didn't build the machine for the edge of the curve. Sorzal was quiet for a long time after that. Kale finished his meal. He left a tip that was larger than the meal itself, which he did partly because he could now, and partly because the service staff had been kind to him across 30 sessions, and kindness was worth recognizing when you had the means to recognize it. He spent 2 days on the conclave after that, mostly handling the financial transfer, and then he spent a portion of his winnings on a ship, modest, functional, reliable, a good ship for moving through space without calling attention to yourself. It had a small galley and a bunk that was better than the one he had rented on the station, and enough cargo space to take on short-haul jobs when the funds ran low. Vaccine was at the docking bay when Kale boarded. The old scholar had brought nothing with him, no going-away gift, no formal gesture. He simply stood near the access ramp with the expression of someone who was satisfied to have witnessed something they suspected was possible, but had never seen confirmed. "What will you do now?" Vaccine asked. "Move," Kale said. "There are a lot of places I haven't been yet." He paused at the top of the ramp. "And you?" "I have enough material," Vaccine said, "for a very interesting paper." Kale smiled. It was the most expression he had shown in 30 sessions. He went aboard, and the ramp closed. The ship left the dock without ceremony, no fanfare, and no announcement. It slid out of the conclave's gravitational field and angled away from the neutron stars, just another small vessel moving through the enormous quiet of space. Behind it, the celestial conclave continued its operations under the conclave's financial authority, pending restructuring. The Vrethkai Syndicate retained limited control, subject to oversight, pending the resolution of the audit findings. The gaming floor stayed open. The service drones kept running. The neon signs kept glowing. The cascade table stood at the center of the main floor, its reactive glass surface still, waiting for the next player. Somewhere in the administrative network of the galaxy, a standard advisory memo was being drafted and reviewed and distributed through the Syndicate's affiliate channels. It moved through the network slowly, routed through stations that passed it along the way. News of institutional significance traveled. Not fast, not urgent, but steady. When it arrived at each affiliate station, the memo was added to the list of formal advisories that every syndicate-affiliated operation was required to post in their management records. It was a single paragraph long. It had been written by the senior legal team with the kind of care you apply to words that will be read for a very long time. It said, "Do not wager against humans. Flag all human challenge applicants for senior review. Do not allow unescorted human players access to probability-adaptive game systems without executive approval." At the bottom of the memo, one of the legal advisors had added a note that was not official and not required, and that she had included anyway because it was accurate, and because she thought it was important to be accurate. The note said, "This advisory is precautionary. In practice, implementation will be difficult. By the time you are reading this, the relevant damage has almost certainly already occurred at some locations. We are, in all likelihood, not the only house that has made this mistake. We are simply the first to document it.